The news from my doctor was a quiet clinical execution. He spoke in the gentle, measured tones that physicians reserve for the condemned. His words a soft, steady rain of medical jargon that all meant the same thing. My life, as I knew it, was over. A rare, aggressive, and inoperable form of cancer. The prognosis was measured in months, not years. I walked out of his hushed, elegant office and into the bright, indifferent city sunlight, a ghost in my own body. The world was a movie playing on a screen, and I was no longer in it, just a spectator in the back row, watching the final credits begin to roll. All I wanted was my husband. I needed the solid, reassuring presence of Mark, the man who had been my anchor for 12 years. I needed to fall into his arms and let his strength be my own, just for a little while. I took a cab home, my mind a numb, silent void. The key felt heavy and strange in my hand as I pushed it into the lock of our small, cozy house, the home where we had built our life, a life that was now a ticking clock. I opened the door, a single desperate word on my lips. Mark? And what I saw in my own living room did more than just break my heart. It took the shattered pieces of my spirit and ground them into dust dot. It wasn't a scene of infidelity, not in the traditional sense. It was something far more cruel, far more profound. Mark was there, standing in the center of the room, a bottle of champagne in one hand, a glass in the other. He was beaming, his face, the face I loved more than any other, alight with a triumphant, ecstatic joy I hadn't seen in years. Standing opposite him, her own glass raised, was a woman I didn't recognize, a sharp, elegant woman in a tailored suit with a predatory smile. And between them, on our coffee table, was a stack of freshly printed books. On the cover was a dramatic, moody photograph of a windswept coastline and a single, bold name, Mark Thorne. He had done it. After a decade of struggle, of rejection, letters of the quiet, gnawing bitterness of failure, he had finally sold his novel. This was not a scene of mourning for my impending death. This was a celebration of his new life. He saw me then, standing in the doorway, my face pale with a truth far more devastating than the one the doctor had given me. The ecstatic joy on his face didn't falter. It sharpened, hardened into something else, annoyance, impatience, as if I were an unwelcome interruption at my own funeral. Alice, he said, his voice flat, all the warmth gone. You're home early. The woman, his agent, I presumed, looked from his face to mine, a flicker of professional unease in her eyes. Mark, perhaps I should go, she said quietly. No, stay. Cynthia, he said, his gaze never leaving mine. It's fine. Alice was just leaving. I stared at him, my mind unable to process the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the moment. I had come home with a death sentence, seeking comfort, and had walked into my own eviction notice. I don't understand, I whispered, the words feeling thin and useless in the suddenly silent room. Of course you don't, he said, and the bitterness of a decade of perceived failure was now a venom in his voice. You've never understood. You, with your stable, predictable little graphic design business, your quiet little life. You have no idea what this means. This is my life, Alice, my real life. Finally starting. He took a deliberate step closer, his eyes cold and hard. I'm sorry about your situation, he said, a vague, dismissive gesture that encompassed my entire catastrophic medical diagnosis. But I cannot be tied down by this. Not now. Not when I'm on the verge of everything I've ever worked for. I can't be the sad, devoted husband nursing his dying wife. It's not a good look for a debut novelist. It's a tragic story, and I'm done with tragic stories. He was not just leaving me. He was rebranding. I was a liability to his new, successful image. My illness was an inconvenient plot point in the triumphant story of his life. I've been unhappy for years, Alice, he continued, the words a torrent of long-suppressed resentment. Trapped in this quiet, boring life, watching you be so content, so satisfied with your small world. I need more. I deserve more. This, he said, gesturing to the book, to the champagne, to the sharp, successful woman who was not his wife. This is my world, and you are not a part of it. He walked over to the desk in the corner and took out a checkbook. He wrote a check with a flourish and tore it out, holding it out to me. This should be enough to get you started somewhere else, he said. Consider it a severance package for your 12 years of service. I looked at the check, at the man I had loved, the man I had supported, the man whose dreams I had subsidized with my own steady, reliable income, and I looked at the woman he had become, a stranger with a cruel, triumphant smile. The grief for My own impending death was suddenly, completely eclipsed by the grief for the death of the man I thought he was. I didn't take the check. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply turned, walked out of the door, and closed it quietly behind me on the life that was no longer mine. My spirit wasn't just broken, it was gone. I was a hollowed out shell, a ghost leaving a house that was already haunted by a future I would never be a part of. The weeks that followed were a descent into a quiet, gray hell. I didn't fight him. I had no fight left in me. The cancer was a roaring fire in my body, and his betrayal had been the wind that fanned the flames. I signed the divorce papers his lawyer sent over, a document that stripped me of everything we had built together, leaving him with the house, the assets, and his brilliant new future. I was too tired, too sick to care. I retreated to the one place I had left in the world, my grandmother's cottage. It was a small, forgotten house on a remote stretch of the Oregon coast, a place that smelled of salt, damp wood, and the ghosts of a happier time. It had been empty for years, a dusty, silent time capsule. It was the perfect place for a woman who was just waiting to die. I began the grueling, soul-crushing process of chemotherapy. My local doctor, a kind, weary man named Dr. Evans, was gentle, but honest. The experimental treatment was a long shot, a 1 in 100 chance. I accepted the news with a strange, detached calm. I had nothing to live for anyway. My days were a monotonous cycle of sickness, exhaustion, and a profound, crushing loneliness. I would sit for hours on the small, weathered porch, watching the endless, gray expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a perfect reflection of the emptiness inside me. One afternoon, seeking a distraction from the nausea and the pain, I began to sort through the boxes my grandmother had left in the attic. She had been my anchor, my true north, a woman of quiet strength and a fierce, secret intelligence. She had been a writer too, a woman who had filled dozens of journals with her stories, her observations, her beautiful, unpublished words. I found them in an old sea chest, a stack of leather-bound journals, their pages filled with her familiar, elegant cursive. I began to read, and in the quiet, dusty attic, I discovered a story that would change everything. My grandmother, a woman I had known as a simple small-town librarian, had lived a secret life. In her youth, she had been a ghostwriter, the silent, uncredited author behind one of the most celebrated male novelists of her generation, a man named Alistair Finch, a name I vaguely recognized from my college literature classes. The journals were a heartbreaking, detailed account of their arrangement. She would write the novels, pouring her heart and her genius onto the page. He, the handsome, charismatic man with the connections and the confidence, would put his name on the cover and take all the credit. He paid her a small, secret stipend, enough to live on, but a fraction of the fortune he was making from her words. He had convinced her it was the only way, that the world was not ready for a female literary voice of her power. He had stolen her legacy, and she had let him, a quiet, willing accomplice in her own erasure. Have you ever found a piece of your own story in the life of an ancestor? It was a chilling, profound echo across the generations. My grandmother and I, 2 different women in 2 different eras, had both been the silent, invisible muses for the ambitious men we loved. We had given them our gifts, our souls, and they had taken the credit, casting us aside when we were no longer useful. The betrayal I thought was mine was actually a legacy. Tucked into the back of the final journal was the proof. The original, handwritten manuscripts of 2 of Alistair Finch's most famous Pulitzer Prize-winning novels, and a series of letters from him, letters that detailed their arrangement, letters that praised her uncommon genius, while simultaneously reminding her of the terms of her silence. As I sat there, the evidence of a 50-year-old literary crime. In my hands, something inside me shifted. A tiny, forgotten ember of the woman I used to be began to glow. The rage I had been too sick and too heartbroken to feel for myself, I now felt for my grandmother. The injustice of it, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the theft was a call to arms. And then a miracle happened. My next checkup with Dr. Evans was a few weeks later. He did the routine blood work, the scans. He came into the examination room with a look of stunned, utter disbelief on his face. "Alice," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and confusion. "I don't know how to explain this. The tumors, they're shrinking. The treatment, the 1 in 100 shot, it's working. It's working in a way I have never seen before. I had been given a second chance, a reprieve from my death sentence. And I knew with a certainty that was as clear and as bright as a supernova what I was going to do with it. I was no longer a dying woman with nothing to lose. I was a survivor, and I had a story to tell. Not just mine, but my grandmother's too. The war was not over. It had just begun. The news of my remission was a quiet personal revolution. It was a second chance I had never expected, a future that had been a blank white wall now suddenly filled with a dizzying array of possibilities. For the first few weeks, I did nothing but heal. I walked on the beach, I breathed the salt-laced air, and I felt my strength, both physical and spiritual, slowly returning. The rage and the grief were still there, but they were no longer a crushing weight. They were fuel. I looked at my grandmother's journals, at the proof of her stolen legacy, and I looked at my own life. I thought of Mark's novel, the one that had been the catalyst for my destruction. I ordered a copy. It arrived a few days later, its glossy cover a monument to his betrayal. I began to read, and the fuel of my anger ignited into a white-hot righteous. Fired Up the book wasn't just his story, it was ours. He had taken the intimate details of our life together, our private jokes, our shared sorrows, our most vulnerable conversations, and he had twisted them, repurposed them, and sold them as his own fictional creation. The main character, a struggling, misunderstood artist, was a thinly veiled, romanticized version of himself. And the wife, a quiet, supportive, but ultimately passionless and uninspiring woman who was holding him back, was a cruel, distorted caricature of me. He hadn't just left me. He had plagiarized my soul and then edited me into a villain in my own life story. There is no greater violation than having your own life stolen and sold back to you as a story you don't recognize. He had been my partner and my confidant, the keeper of my most intimate secrets. And he had seen it all not as a shared life, but as raw material. I was not his wife. I was his research. That was the final clarifying moment. My fight was no longer just for my grandmother. It was for me. It was for the reclamation of my own narrative. My first call was to a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a sharp, aggressive literary lawyer in New York, a woman with a reputation for being a shark. I told her my story, both of them. The story of my grandmother's stolen masterpieces and the story of my own plagiarized life. She was silent for a long time on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, dangerous purr. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, "I believe we have a case. In fact, I believe we have two of the most explosive literary cases of the century." Our strategy was a two-pronged attack. The first was the lawsuit against the Alistair Finch estate. It was a behemoth, a powerful literary foundation that guarded his legacy with a religious fervor. They would fight us with everything they had. But we had the one thing they couldn't fight, the truth, in my grandmother's own elegant hand. The second part of the plan was more subtle, more personal. It was my own story. "You need to write it, Alice," Sarah told me, her voice firm. "You need to tell your own story in your own words. You need to publish it before he can publish his second novel. You need to control the narrative." And so I began to write. I sat in my grandmother's quiet, sunlit cottage, the sound of the ocean a steady rhythm outside my window, and I wrote. I wrote about my marriage, about the love and the lies. I wrote about my diagnosis, about the despair, about the quiet, unexpected miracle of my recovery. And I wove my grandmother's story into my own, a tale of two women, a generation apart, who had been silenced by the men they loved, who had been the invisible ink in the stories of great men. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It was like performing surgery on my own heart, cutting out the diseased tissue, examining it, and then piece by painful piece, stitching myself back together. While I wrote, Sarah launched the first salvo. The lawsuit against the Finch estate landed like a bomb in the quiet, genteel world of literary publishing. The estate, as expected, responded with a furious, dismissive denial, calling my claims the delusional fantasies of a desperate woman. They tried to paint my grandmother as an obsessed fan, a fantasist, but then Sarah released the proof. High-resolution scans of my grandmother's handwritten manuscripts, side by side with the published text of Alistair Finch's novels. The evidence was undeniable. The literary world erupted. The story was on the front page of every major newspaper. The legacy of a literary icon was suddenly, irrevocably in question. Meanwhile, Mark's career was soaring. His debut novel was a critical and commercial smash hit. He was being hailed as the new, brilliant voice of his generation. He was on talk shows, his face in magazines, his story of the tragic loss of his wife, now a compelling, romantic part of his public persona. He had no idea that a storm was gathering, a storm that was about to make his own personal tragedies feel very, very real. My book, which I titled The Ghostwriter, was finished in a feverish 6-month sprint. Sarah, using the buzz from the Finch lawsuit, secured me a massive publishing deal. The release was scheduled for the fall, just as the hype for Mark's second novel was beginning to build. The day my book was released, I was terrified. I have laid my soul bare for the world to see, but the response was overwhelming. The book was a sensation. It was more than just a memoir. It was a rallying cry. Women from all over the world began to write to me, sharing their own stories of being silenced, of being the invisible partners in the success of the men in their lives. I had thought I was telling my own small personal story. I had inadvertently told the story of millions. And then the final phase of our plan went into motion. The Finch estate, facing a public relations nightmare and a mountain of irrefutable evidence, was forced to settle. They publicly acknowledged my grandmother's contribution. They reissued Alistair Finch's most famous novels with a new co-author. Credit by Alistair Finch and Eleanor Vance. My grandmother, the ghost, had finally been given her name. The settlement was massive, a fortune that was rightfully hers. I used it to establish the Eleanor Vance Foundation, a grant program dedicated to supporting and promoting the work of undiscovered female writers. The news of the Finch settlement and the revelation of my grandmother's story cast a new suspicious light on my own. The parallels were too obvious, too damning. The whispers started. The literary world began to look at Mark Thorne not as a genius, but as a man with a suspicious pattern of benefiting from the muses in his life. His publisher, terrified of the scandal, put the release of his second novel on hold, pending an internal review. His muse, the sharp, elegant agent who had been at his side on that fateful day, quietly resigned from his agency. His perfect, brilliant new life was beginning to unravel. The final confrontation was not a dramatic, tearful scene. It was quiet and public and utterly devastating. I was being interviewed on a major television show. The host, a sharp, intelligent woman, asked me the question I knew was coming. Your ex-husband, the novelist, Mark Thorne, she said, her eyes full of a sympathetic but journalistic curiosity. Whose first novel, which he has said was inspired by your life together, have you read it? I looked directly into the camera, into the eyes of millions of people, into the eyes of the man who had tried to destroy me. I have, I said, my voice calm and clear. And it's a beautiful work of fiction, particularly the parts about his own contributions. You see, my husband was a wonderful storyteller, but the best stories he ever told were his own. I should know. I was the one who wrote them for him. The silence in the television studio was absolute. I had just dropped a nuclear bomb on my television into the heart of the literary world. I had no proof, no handwritten manuscript to back up my claim. Just my word, but I was no longer the unknown grieving wife. I was a best-selling author, a woman who had just been vindicated in one of the biggest literary scandals of the century. My word was enough. The fallout for Mark was immediate and absolute. His publisher dropped him. His agent, the one who had replaced Cynthia, dropped him. The book deal was canceled. He was a pariah, a fraud, a one-hit wonder whose one hit had just been revealed. As a stolen melody, he was ruined. A few weeks later, a package arrived at my cottage. It was a first edition of his novel. On the inside cover, he had written a single, desperate, pathetic sentence. You were always the better writer, Izzy. I'm sorry. I looked at the book, at the final, dying echo of the man who had tried to erase me, and I felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction, just a quiet, profound sense of peace. I took the book and I walked out to the small fire pit in my backyard, the one where I would sit and watch the stars. I dropped it into the flames and watched as the pages, filled with his lies and my stolen life, curled, blackened, and turned to ash. I had come to this cottage to die. But instead, I had found my grandmother's voice, and in doing so, I had rediscovered my own. The story of my life was no longer a tragic tale written by a cruel, selfish man. It was a story of survival, of resilience, of the quiet, unshakable power of a woman's voice. And it was a story that I was finally, beautifully writing for myself. The years that followed were a quiet, steady rebuilding. The Eleanor Vance Foundation became my life's work, a thriving testament to my grandmother's stolen genius. We discovered and launched the careers of dozens of brilliant female writers. women whose voices might otherwise have been lost to the world. I never wrote another memoir. I didn't need to. I had told my story. Instead, I turned to fiction, writing novels about strong, complicated women who found their power in unexpected places. I found love again, a different kind of love. A quiet, gentle partnership with Dr. Evans, the kind, weary doctor who had been the first to give me a glimmer of hope. We built a life together, a real one, based on honesty and a shared understanding of the precious, fragile gift of a second chance. One day, a letter arrived, forwarded from my publisher. It was from Mark. He was writing from a small, obscure town in the Midwest where he was working as a high school English teacher. It was not a letter asking for forgiveness. He knew he was beyond that. It was a letter of understanding. I teach my students about narrative, he wrote, about the power of a story to shape a life. And I use my own as a cautionary tale. A story of a man who became so obsessed with being the hero of his own story that he forgot that the other people, and it were real. I have started to write again. Not for publication, just for myself. I am trying to learn how to tell the truth. I folded the letter and put it away. It was the final, quiet closing of a long and painful chapter. He had not found redemption, perhaps, but he had found a kind of truth. And that, I suppose, was a form of justice. That evening, I sat on my porch, the same porch where I had once sat and waited to die, and I watched the sun set over the Pacific. I thought of the woman who had arrived here, a hollowed-out shell, a ghost in her own life, and I thought of the woman I was now, a woman surrounded by love, by purpose, by the quiet, steady rhythm of a life she had built from the ashes of another dot. My husband's betrayal had been an act of profound cruelty, an attempt to break my spirit completely. But in the end, he had not been my executioner. He had been my catalyst. He had broken my life, but he had not broken me. He had, in his own monstrous, unintentional way, set me free. He had forced me to find my own voice, to tell my own story, and to become the hero of a narrative that was finally, completely, and beautifully my own.